talking about tomatoes. So if you want to talk about anything else, you have to wait till 11:30. Because we're going to need all our time just to talk about tomatoes. And I wanted to focus on some of the best practices, things we should do. And then there are some things that you may have seen on the internet that you just should not do. And we'll try to highlight some of those. So let's start with what is a tomato? And there's been this ongoing thing of, is it a fruit or is it a vegetable? And it has officially been declared a fruit. And that's because of its botanical nature. But we also know not to put it in our fruit salad, right? We put it in vegetables. Let's back up to the botanical name. Solanum, sol means sun, and we know that tomatoes love the sun. Lycopersicum, and that is where we get the term lycopene, which is what makes your red tomatoes turn red. It's in the family often called nightshade, and there was a long period of time where the whole nightshade family was considered to be toxic, to be poisonous. There are some poisonous things in the family, like the weed that we call nightshade, like you never want to eat those berries. But the Solanaceae family includes potatoes, peppers, eggplant, tomatillas, which some of us grow, ground cherries, if you've never grown, you should try. It also includes tobacco and petunia. Who knew? And down here in the corner, we've got the potato, tomato, pepper plant, cultivated tobacco, and the gypsum weed is also in the family. That's one that you don't really want to mess with. But for gardeners, here's the key. The tomato is usually the king or queen of the garden. If you meet somebody who's gardening at home, you can make a very safe bet that they're growing tomatoes. I've only met one or two people who just don't grow tomatoes because they don't like them, and they grow everything else, but they're the exception. Types of tomatoes. Here's a couple terms. We're going to hit some terminology today. How many have heard determinate and indeterminate? Yeah, do you know what it means? It's confusing to a lot of people, so let's make it simple. Determinate means we know it's going to get so big, and that's usually about 4 feet or so, and then it stops growing. So it gets to a determined height. It produces fruits usually in 1 or 2 major flushes. You get a big set of fruit, and then you'll get a second smaller set of fruit, and if you get a third set, it'll be even smaller. And it needs just a little bit of pruning. So commercial growers tend to grow determinate. They set those plants out, they harvest that first flush, they might harvest the second, and then they yank the plants and put another crop in. Then we have indeterminate, which means it's just going to keep growing, and it's going to grow, and it's going to grow, and it's going to grow. And where does it stop? Only when the frost hits it, or when you decide to remove it. The determinate, you can get away with lightweight support structures. I would still say even most determinants need something stronger than the typical tomato cage. Indeterminate, forget it, tomato cage. First of all, it's going to outgrow it, and as it gets fruits on it, it's just going to topple the whole thing. So indeterminate, because it does get bigger, and by the end of the season, mine are at least 6 feet and often pressing 8 feet, you need a really strong trellis. So you're talking things like cattle panels and tea stakes. And it produces fruits continuously throughout the summer. Now the interesting thing on the indeterminate is that first cluster is low, the next cluster is a little higher, next cluster is a little higher, and you'll notice, by the end of the season, there's nothing going on down here on the bottom. And that's why we keep pruning and removing the vegetation, because A, it's older, it's not providing shade to anything except the ground. So the indeterminates need a whole lot of pruning. And once they get well established, I would tell you, you're going to be pruning about every week. I volunteer at Concord United Methodist, where this year we have 216 tomatoes, and we prune every week. And we'll get a crew of 5 or 6 people in there and spend several hours pruning 216 plants. And the first timers come back a week or 2 later, and we say, what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to go prune tomatoes. Didn't we do that? Well, take a look at the plants. Well, it looks like we didn't prune them. The indeterminates just keep growing. So they need a fair amount of attention, and we're pruning them for airflow to reduce the disease load and for sunshine. And again, I mentioned earlier the Prune Like a Pro video that is out on the YouTube channel, and I gave you the link in the handout. Disease resistance. Now, how many people start their own from seed versus going and buying plants? Oh, no shame, that's okay. In either case, you want to know how resistant whatever you're planting is to the most common diseases. So the problem with buying one is the plant tag is only, an inch wide and a couple inches long, and you can't get a lot of data on that. If you're starting from seed, you order them from a seed catalog. The seed catalogs have very, very detailed lists of, this variety has high resistance to a particular disease, medium resistance, or low resistance. So on the left here, these are the most common ones, and you might see some of these codes on the plant tag. What I would say is the more codes you see on the plant tag, the more resistant that plant is to disease. If it doesn't have any codes, then you don't know if it has no resistance or they just didn't bother to put the codes on the tag. And over here on the right, more of an eye test, but it's a much longer list, and they, across the top, list the most common: Fusarium, Verticillium, tobacco head, mosaic, nematodes, white, VER, blossom, and rot. And then they indicate which ones are resistant to that. So if you can get a more resistant variety, you are likely to have less disease if you're taking good care. And you can imagine on a plant tag, they're going to use these abbreviations because they definitely don't have room to spell it out. So rather than memorize all these, just the more codes you see, the more disease resistant that particular plant is. Crop rotation, this is a biggie. One of the early years at Concord, there was a volunteer who came in one night and said, I don't know what's wrong with my tomatoes. Well, talk to me. Well, the first year they were absolutely fantastic. The second year they were really good. The third year, not so good. The fourth year, pretty poor. And this year, they're just downright pathetic. And I'm doing the same thing. So what's wrong? And my first question was, where are you planting them? In the same spot. So tomatoes get 2 types of diseases. One is soil-borne, and the other is airborne. If you get soil-borne disease and you keep planting tomatoes in the same spot, you build up a population of that soil-borne disease. And so by his 4th or 5th year, he had a nice population of disease which was attacking his plants almost as soon as he put them in the ground. This is why we make a really big deal out of if you're planting in ground or in raised beds, rotate where you plant your tomatoes each year. If you're planting in containers, you definitely want to seriously amend that soil every year. I would actually suggest dumping it out, putting it somewhere else, getting fresh stuff for your tomatoes. And here's the nice part. Grow something else in that pot the next year, because the soil-borne diseases, these particular ones, only attack tomatoes. So if you go plant a brassica in there, a broccoli or a cauliflower or something, they get different diseases. So we recommend at least a 3-year rotation. And if you can do 4 or 5 years, that's even better. Because if you're not growing a tomato, then that soil-borne disease has nothing to live on, and it will fade with time. And hopefully by the time you rotate back around, it's gone. It got starved out. And in the bottom right here is just an example. So here, year one, the tomatoes were here, and they had a legume and carrot. Year two, tomatoes moved to this bed. Year three, it moves to this bed. Year four, it would come back up here. It's why, if you're building raised beds in particular, we say do a multiple of 3. If you've got 3 beds, then you can rotate your tomato family, your brassica family, and your vine crop family. And if you want to grow a lot of things, then don't go from 3 beds to 4 beds, go from 3 beds to 6 beds. Okay, hundreds of varieties. Here's where we could spend all day. In fact, there's about 7,500 varieties. And I'm sure that any one of you could name a variety that you'd like, and I've never grown it. And I've grown a lot of tomatoes, but I haven't grown all of them. We have choices in colors. So who only grows red tomatoes? We only grow red tomatoes at the community garden because one year we grew a variety called Lemon Boy, which was highly rated and highly disease resistant, but the volunteers wouldn't pick them. It's like, why aren't you picking them? Oh, we're waiting for them to turn red. So we only grow red tomatoes at the community garden. I think the yellows are really tasty, but I'm not going to make a tomato sauce out of them because it just doesn't look right? So if I want to make a sauce, I'm going to go red tomato. If I want to slice her and make a BLT, yeah, yellow tomato's fine. And there are purple tomatoes and black tomatoes, and you name it, there's, you mentioned Mr. Stripey. That's multicolored. We have different shapes, right? We've got nice big round slicers. We've got some pear shapes and Romas. Thinking of golden is often that shape. We've got yellow in here and the like. And then we've got the little ones. So how many folks like to grow the little tomatoes? Those are my snacking ones. But if you don't pick them every day, they get ahead of you. Would you agree? Different textures. Some of them are really firm. Some, I've grown tomatoes that when I picked it, and it wasn't overripe, it still was kind of mushy. I don't know, mushy tomato. Some have more seeds. Look at all the seeds in here versus how few, there's so many fewer seeds in that. And then different flavors. It goes back a few years, but Dr. Natalie Baumgartner, who oversees the statewide Master Gardener program and is also an associate professor at UT, had done all these trials, and she invited some of us in for a taste testing. And let me tell you, after 21 different varieties, I did not want another tomato. But it was amazing how different the flavors were of different tomatoes. And the funniest one was, one of the older Master Gardeners took one bite and just said, yuck. And the rest of us were all kind of biting our tongues because we thought the same thing about that particular variety. And it turns out that that variety is not a particularly tasty tomato, but it is highly resistant to disease, soil-borne diseases. So it is used as rootstock when they graft tomatoes. How many folks have ever seen a grafted tomato at a nursery? There are more and more of them. And they tend to be really pricey because it took 2 plants to make one, right? You have the rootstock that you keep and cut off a couple inches above the ground, and then you've got the scion, which may be something like a Cherokee purple that you graft on top. Because the Cherokee purple, being an heirloom, is not very resistant to disease. So at least you've addressed the soil-borne disease with this yucky-tasting tomato that's highly resistant. And now you only have to deal with the airborne disease for the top part, which is Cherokee purple. But they tend to be about twice the price of a standard individual plant. Now, one of the things you want to wrestle with, and one of the things that causes us to grow different tomatoes, is what are you going to do with them? Are you just, you just want to go out and pick those little cherry tomatoes and snack on them, or throw them in a salad, or do you want a slicer that you can make a BLT out of with, if Joe Pardue were here, would say it has to be Duke's mayonnaise. Do you like just a straight tomato sandwich? I don't like soggy bread. So there are certain tomatoes that I would never put in a sandwich, and others that will only go in a sandwich. Or, so if you're fresh eating, then you're growing basically what you can consume. And if you have surplus, there's any number of places that you can donate it and get it to a food pantry. Or are you growing to preserve? So are you going to make tomato juice or tomato sauce? Are you going to make salsa, tomato paste? Are you going to dry them? So all of those factors go into deciding which tomatoes you want to grow. Now, this is my bias, but these are my favorites. For the little cherry size, I go with Sun Gold. It is a golden orange color, about this dime size. It is like eating candy. These never make it back into the house. These are the ones I just go to. So does anybody else grow the Sun Gold? Yeah, see a couple hands going up. There are some newer varieties. There's a new one called Sun Peach. I haven't tried it because I really like this one. It's like, how could anything be sweeter than this? Here, this is a Cherokee Purple. They are not the prettiest looking tomatoes, but in my mind, they are the best for fresh eating. I just think they have the greatest taste. This is a large Roma. And when I say large, I'm talking fist size, called Big Mama. It's an exclusive to Berkeley. So you either buy Berkeley seeds and start them, or you can buy a plant from Berkeley. But buying plants online and paying shipping gets really pricey. And then for drying, I have started to grow San Marzano. And every year I try something new. So new for me this year is one from Berkeley called Little Mama, and I'm substituting that for Juliet. Anybody here ever grow Juliet? Grows in great big clusters, about an inch or inch and a quarter long, kind of oval shape. Very prolific producer. But part of my concern was the last time I bought seeds, they came and it said product of Taiwan. And that concerned me. So I went looking for a substitute for Juliet. Maybe that was an exception that year, I don't know. And then for a slicing tomato this year, I'm trying a variety called steak sandwich. Sounds like it should be a good sandwich tomato, right? With a name like that. So who's got some favorites that you want to share?
Better Boy.
Better Boy? We grow those at Concord.
I like Best Boy.
Best Boy?
I have one called Better Boy Plus that seems to be a really good performer.
Okay.
Early Girl.
Early Girl, okay? Yeah, and the names are usually pretty descriptive. So Better Boy Plus, they clearly took Better Boy.
Or Big Beef Plus is what I meant to
Oh,
say.
Big Beef Plus, well, they took Big Beef and they tweaked it a little
They
bit.
added tomato spotted wilt virus.
Okay, so they did some hybridizing, and that's the key. You'll notice a lot of the plants today, if you research them, they are hybrids. And the hybrid seed is more expensive, the hybrid plant is more expensive, but they've been breeding them to either improve the taste or to improve the disease resistance. When you go to wherever you're buying your plants, how do you decide which one to buy? Who here raised their hand for buying plants? Yeah. How did you decide? You knew what you wanted?
I knew what I wanted, and honestly, I think it really doesn't matter that much.
Oh, I hope you leave today thinking differently.
Okay. That's why I'm here.
Yeah, because there's such a wide variety in flavor, in taste, in disease resistance. But if you have found ones that you like, then by all means keep buying those. You may have just stumbled across one that does really well for you and you like it. Yeah, if you had bought the Mountain Merit, you'd be looking for a different one.
Plastic.
Yeah. Ellie?
I look for something that isn't very tall, doesn't have any blossoms on it, just, you know, nice, good, something that I can trim those bottom leaves off and get it going.
Yeah, I need to pay you for being my straight person. Because whether you're starting seeds or you're buying a transplant, don't do it too early. These are warm season veggies. And we get a couple of days in the 70s and people rush out. The one that really breaks my heart. This is a picture from Costco. It's a couple years old because the plant was only $13.99. I know the price is higher this year. But in March, I watched people walking out of the Costco with a plant that big. It already had blossoms on it, already had some small fruits on it. And I'm thinking, what are you going to do with this? Because if you set it out, we're going to have another frost, and you just wasted $14, $15.
Well, I'll tell you what, because I did just that.
I'm
This
gonna
is
say-
what happens with them, you just throw them out because they
Yeah.
die.
Because one frost and you're done.
So
So,
I try to keep them, you know, in the pots until I was free of
but
frost.
unless you have a really good grow light set up, and are you going to do that when you buy one or two of these expensive plants? So no, I'm not trying to pick on you. So your takeaway today is don't buy these. Wait a little longer. So, yeah, don't start too early. Don't start the seeds too early. And even what I have learned, the seed packet almost always says tomatoes start indoors 6 to 8 weeks before you will set them out. Now, they write it that way because those seeds get sold all across the country. And our last frost is different than the last frost even in Middle Tennessee, much less Western Tennessee, much less Colorado or California. So it's always, you need to know when's our average last frost. You also need to understand that average last frost means there's a 50% chance. And that 50% chance, average last frost, is April 15th. By April 22nd, we're down to only about a 25% chance of frost. And by a week later, April 29th, we're down to about a 10% chance. So you really don't want to set them out before the very end of April or the first week in May. Just looking at the frost factor. Now, as I mentioned, we get a couple of nice 70, 75 degree days and people get excited, let's go plant. My question to you is, okay, that's a daytime temp. What's the nighttime temp going to be? Because tomatoes don't like it below 50. So we might have 70 during the day and 45 at night. I'm not putting out my tomato plants. The other is, what's the soil temperature? And I'm here to tell you that wet soil is colder than dry soil. So how do you know? For years, I just used an inexpensive kitchen thermometer, and then I finally splurged and bought a soil thermometer. But the sensor's at the tip, so if I'm going to plant tomatoes down 3 or 4 inches deep, then I'm going to set this in the ground 3 or 4 inches, and I can tell you that this morning, at 3 or 4 inches, the soil temperature is 70 degrees. Tomatoes will be happy with that. It's also May 15th, so it should be about 70 degrees by now. The other is, if you're buying plants, don't rush home and stick them in the ground the same day. Even if you bought it today, don't go home and stick it in the ground today, because it has not been fully hardened off. Even at the nursery, when you walk around, or go to the big box store, that's where it's really obvious, look up. What do they have? They've got shade cloth over the top. So these plants have not been exposed to full sunlight. So you need to take, if I'm starting seeds, this hardening off process takes me about a week. So the first day they go out in the morning and they get an hour, maybe an hour and a half. If it's a cloudy day, maybe 2. The next day you leave them out a little longer, the third day even longer. By about day 5 or 6, I'm watching the nighttime temperature and saying, well, can you leave them out overnight tonight? Oh, no, it's going to be 50, I'm going to bring them in. But you harden them off over the process of about a week when you've started your own. You could probably get it done in 3 or 4 days with a plant that you bought at the nursery, because it's been outside, but it has had shade cloth, so it hasn't had full sun yet. And they leave them out overnight. So you want to watch the weather forecast. You want to watch, we all notice what the daytime temps are, but what you really want to look at, what's the nighttime temperature forecast. And again, for tomatoes, we want it to be above 50. In the family, peppers don't like it below 55. And we want the soil temp to be at least 60 degrees. Any questions on that? Is that new for a lot of people? Okay. Now, we want to water consistently when Mother Nature doesn't do her job. So far, she's doing her job. In fact, she's doing, my garden is pretty wet. What we want is consistent watering. And while we do want to mulch them to help manage weeds, we want to wait about 2 weeks from when we put them in the ground to when we mulch. Because here we are, it's May 15th, it's warming up, the days are getting warmer, the nights are getting warmer. But mulch does 2 things. It helps hold moisture. I don't need to hold any more moisture at the moment. But more importantly, it moderates soil temperature. So you won't get fluctuations in soil temp as much when it is mulched. But at this point, we still want the soil to warm up some more. So if I mulch them as soon as I plant, I'm kind of slowing down the rate at which the soil is going to warm up. So I highly recommend that you wait about 2 weeks, let the soil warm up some more, and then come back and mulch your tomato plants to help manage the weeds. And somewhere in here I did say plant deeply. So in this diagram, here's the plant that I bought, or that I started, and I would recommend that you take off that leaf and that stem, at least those 2. And in an optimal situation, I would actually take off this one as well, and then I would plant it to this depth. That's planting deeply. Now, why do we want to do that? I brought some props along today. And I have already trimmed these. And these were started April 6th. So this is like 6 weeks. Using 6 to 8 weeks? Yeah, 6 weeks. Next year, 4 weeks on these. But if you look at these, I'll let you pass that around. Look at all those little hairs at the bottom of the stem. All those little hairs, when you plant deeply, like this one, when they make contact with moist soil, they turn into roots. Now, the more roots you have, the more nutrition your plant can take up, the healthier it's going to be, the more disease resistant it will be. So we want to plant deeply. It's another reason to wait for the soil to warm up, because the deeper you go, the cooler it's going to be in the spring. Yeah, this is something that it hurts in the beginning when you start stripping off those lower leaves. But once you see how well that works, you become a convert to that. We were mentioning sun golds while that's coming on. I have 2 sun golds here. Now, these were started. Sun golds are those little cherry tomatoes, and they take off and they want to vine. They get what I call wild and woolly. These were started March 25th. So this is, again, 7 weeks. I think that's 6 to 8. But look at this. Doesn't have any flowers on it yet. But again, on this one, this is actually so big, break this apart, that in planting this one, I would probably use what's called a trench, where instead of just digging a hole, you dig a trench about 4 inches deep, and you lay it this way, strip these off, and then bend this to come up. And again, all those little root hairs will become roots. But there's no way you're going to dig a hole 8 or 10 inches deep and plant that up to there. But you can lay it in a little 4-inch deep trench, and bend this up and let it keep going. I try not to have plants so big that they have to do that, but that one is definitely
Do you bend it up?
very carefully. I mean, you're not trying to make a 90-degree turn, right? So you just bend it lightly. No, it's gonna, this, between my two hands is gonna be buried in the ground.
And that will
And
eventually...
this part will straighten up, right? It's a sun-loving plant. It's gonna straighten up and grow towards the sun. Any other questions or comments? I thought I saw it over here. Yes?
What are you using for mulch?
I use not quite finished compost. So I do a lot of composting in the fall. It's largely leaves and coffee grounds. It's not quite done, but I will use it as mulch. And here's the key. Leave the mulch on top. Do not work it into the soil. If you work it into the soil, then it's going to suck out nitrogen to finish decomposing. But if you just lay it on the top as mulch, it's fantastic. Yes?
Would you say 6 inches is deep, or is that too deep
For planting?
for tomatoes?
Oh, you can do 6 inches. Yeah. Yeah. On this plant, that one probably definitely went in 6 inches. And if I saw only a little bit of the footage of John Tullock at Stanley's, but I know you were in the audience because I saw the picture. But he was talking about planting them even deeper. And my concern is, how do you dig a hole that deep unless you've got a good auger? You know, a plant auger, not a gigantic auger. Yeah, 6 inches is about the most you can do with a soil knife or a hand trowel. Okay, other comments or questions here? Okay, watering. I mentioned we want consistent watering. And that's, I mean, you can't control what Mother Nature does, but if Mother Nature doesn't rain, then you need to make sure you water. It's coming up on I think, the next slide. But if you don't have a rain gauge, get a rain gauge. Because otherwise, how do you know how much rain you got? How do you know if you need to water? Now, you can also, for about $10, buy a moisture meter. So this morning, I went out and stuck this in the ground, and at about 3 inches, it registered about an 8, which is the bottom end of wet. And when I stuck it down even further, it just pegged at 10. This scale goes 1 to 10, and it's roughly 10% to 100% moisture. And with all the rain that we have had, 5 inches in January, 5 inches in February, 5 inches in March, when not much was growing, right? So all that water's in the soil. 4 inches in April, and I've recorded 4.5 inches so far in May. So yeah, when I put this in at 6 inches deep, it pegged the needle at 10. And part of my concern was there are certain plants that don't like that, and roots are likely to rot. But on the tomatoes, I'm thinking, oh, those little hairs are going to become roots because it's nice and moist, right? So there's a plus and a minus. But coming back to this, generally, if we don't get 1 inch of rain, then you want to water enough to get us up to 1 inch of rain. So if you get a 1/2 inch of rain, you need to add a 1/2 inch of water per week for most of the months until we get to the heat of the summer, and then that jumps to, we really need 2 inches a week. Here is the magic figure. 1 inch of rain takes, to get the equivalent of 1 inch of rain, takes 0.6 of a gallon per square foot. So let that sink in for a moment. So if you've got a raised bed that is 4 feet by 8 feet, that's 32 square feet, and you need to give that whole bed 1 inch of water, that's 32 times 0.6 is 19 plus gallons, just rounded off to 20 gallons. If you're using a watering can, that means you're making 10 trips per bed. This is when people give up hand watering and say, I'll drag the hose. Similarly, if you are using a hose, I don't care that this nozzle has a setting that says shower. It is not like a rain shower. It has a few holes in it and it comes out with a fair amount of force. What you really want to use is a watering wand because you want to water the soil, not the plant, right? Only Mother Nature gets to make that tomato plant wet. And you hope it dries off by about 11 a.m. And the last thing you want to do is go out and water and make it wet again, and then you have to dry off again. Because wet foliage becomes a magnet for any of those fungal spores floating through the air that result in your airborne diseases. So never wet the foliage. The other is that when you look at the number of holes on the end of that, I mean that's, I don't know, 200 plus holes probably. It comes out more like a shower. So if you need roughly 20 gallons for a 4x8 bed, what do? You hook this up and you get, say, a 5-gallon bucket, and you time how long it takes to fill the bucket. So if it takes you 2 minutes, I'm not saying this is what your water flow rate is, but for the arithmetic, if it takes you 2 minutes to fill the 5-gallon bucket and you need 20 gallons, then you need to stand there for 8 minutes to water that bed. Wear your watch and time yourself. But figure out what your flow rate is coming out of here. You can use your watering can, that's 2 gallons. That just means you multiply by 10 to get to 20. But yeah, never get the foliage wet. And if you get tired of schlepping hoses around and watering wands, then because you've got 30 raised beds in your backyard, you eventually install drip irrigation or soaker hoses. I've done both. I started with soaker hoses, and they only last so long out in the sun, so I eventually converted to drip irrigation. For a long time, I thought that using my finger was the best tool. But the real question is, what's the moisture level down where the roots are, right? The only time you really need to worry about the surface is if you direct seeded something, and we don't direct seed tomatoes, right? We always set off transplants. So you really do want to go a little deeper. So take a tool, you know, an old screwdriver, plunge it down in the soil, pull it up. If the tip of it comes up muddy, you're wet down there. If it comes up dry, or just kind of like dust on the end tip, you're really, really dry. How many people are growing their tomatoes in containers? Okay. Yeah. The determinate varieties, that's why we talk about the term, are better for growing in containers. And the issue is not the plant itself, the issue is the support structure. So if you're growing, you need at least a 5-gallon bucket with drain holes. Please make sure you've got drain holes. But you need a 5-gallon container, whether it's a 5-gallon bucket or a 5-gallon grow bag or a 5-gallon something else. It needs to be at least 5 gallons to accommodate the soil you need to support the plant and have a healthy, productive plant. Now, coming back to reading catalogs and tags, you do want a determinate variety. And a lot of the varieties that work well in containers will say patio tomato or container tomato. And now there are dwarf tomatoes and micro dwarf tomatoes that would be easier to do in a 5-gallon bucket. The determinant, because it only gets about 4 feet high, you don't need that really sturdy, you don't need as sturdy a structure as you need for the indeterminate. And so the issue really is how you're supporting this plant that's growing in a container. Now there are some advantages to growing in containers. You've got complete control over the soil that you put in there. You've got control over the drainage. You can chase the sun, right? I have other crops where I chase the shade, but if you're growing tomatoes in containers, as the sun gets higher in the sky in the middle of the summer, you know, no problem. What are you going to do as we move into fall? Or even now in the spring, when it's still not directly overhead, you can move that container around. A 5-gallon bucket filled with growing medium in a plant is not light, but you can still move it to make sure you're getting enough sunlight for the plant. I've watched another master gardener who did all her gardening in containers on her deck for 1 year because she was watching how the sun tracked across her yard, and then made plans for her in-ground garden based on what she learned by watching the sun. But in that first year, everything she grew was on her patio or deck in a container. You get a little bit more protection from pests. I mean, yes, slugs can climb the side of a 5-gallon bucket, but they're less inclined to do it. They'll go after the easier stuff. And they're really space efficient. So look at the name and the description. As I say, many of them will say patio variety, container variety. And more recently, this one in the bottom, this is a number 2 pencil. This is a micro dwarf. And for folks, I tried one of these last year. I would say it's, in the wintertime, it would be better than any tomato you could buy in the grocery store. But I did not find them to be particularly tasty. But if you want to grow a few tomatoes all winter long indoors and you've got some grow lights, go with the micro dwarf. Because they really only get about as tall as a number 2 pencil. So that'll fit under your grow light if you've gotten to the point that you've got grow lights. Benefits of growing tomatoes in the ground. You can grow any kind in the ground. I actually grew one of those micro dwarfs in the ground. And the problem was it got shaded by bean plants that were about a foot away. And they were bush beans, they weren't pole beans. In the ground requires less watering. The medium that you put in a container is going to dry out, and so you're going to be watering very regularly. And at least with that medium, you probably can stick your finger in. But if you're growing in ground and you've got the native clay soil, you may not be able to stick your finger all the way in the ground. We don't want you to break your finger. You can firmly anchor your support system. So here's T-posts with cattle panels as the supports for tomatoes. It's easier if you're in ground, even in a raised bed, to set up drip irrigation. You can run drip irrigation and get it into your containers, but then you better put your containers in the same spot every year, or you'll be redoing your drip irrigation system. Obviously, in the ground, you've got more space for roots to grow, so, you know, indeterminates really should go in the ground. And because they've got more space to grow, more space for the roots, they tend to be more productive. Pests and diseases. Okay, how many folks have ever seen this lovely caterpillar on their tomatoes? Yeah. Tomato hornworm, which is a cousin to the tobacco hornworm. And guess what? That should be no surprise because tomatoes and tobacco are in the same family. How many have ever seen one looking like this? Yeah. Oh no, this is great. You want to see this. I've got a couple of puzzled looks. This caterpillar is not long for this world. That caterpillar has been parasitized by a beneficial wasp. The wasp laid eggs. The eggs hatch into these little larvae. The larvae enter the caterpillar and eat him from the inside out.
Oh my gosh.
And once he's been parasitized, that caterpillar can't eat. And it will eventually turn completely brown. But the wasp that parasitizes it is a good bug. So you want those. So if you've got these, yes, you can pick them off and dispose of them. Chickens love them if you're raising chickens. Or you can hope that a wasp, well, you can hope that a wasp finds them, but he can do a lot of defoliation in the meantime. But if you see one that looks like it's got little grains of rice on it, Just let it be. He's done eating, and he's not long for this world, and he is being host to a whole family of good wasps. Itty bitty little wasps, but they're good ones. Over here on the right, we've got Septoria leaf spot, which I swear by the end of the season, every tomato plant has it. So it just is a fact of life. This is early blight, which is also pretty common. Neither of these will kill the plant. It may slow down its production if you want to remove all this foliage. The wicked one that I've only seen once in the last dozen years is late blight. If you get late blight, I mean, it just takes a whole combination of weather conditions and stage of development. But late blight will in fact take out the whole plant. You will yank the plant. The plant will just turn to mush. So there's a difference between early blight and late blight. So what do? We regularly prune. So somebody mentioned removing leaves that touch the ground. Absolutely, get them off the ground. What you're doing is creating a smaller target that when it rains and soil splashes up, what's it going to hit? Well, if you don't prune, it's going to hit the leaves, yeah. If you do prune, it's going to hit that hairy stem and probably won't make entry into the plant. Might, but probably won't. So we generally remove any leaves that touch the ground. And then as the plant starts to grow and we start tying it up to the trellis, we remove all the leaves below the bottom of the trellis. I mean, when we set those plants out, first we set them deep, so now they're only half the height of what they were before. Right? We took a 12-inch plant and we stuck it in 4 to 6 inches, so now it's only 7 or 8 inches tall. The really significant one is watch where the first set of blossoms is located and take all the leaves off below that first fruit cluster. The leaves that we keep, we're keeping to shade the fruits so that they don't get sun scald. If there's no fruits below them, those leaves are doing no good. And what you'll find is because tomatoes live so long until frost, the lower leaves are going to start to die anyway, so take them off. So we're pruning to remove diseased leaves. As you're pruning, don't just toss those on the ground. Have your trash, whether it's a bucket or a pail of some sort, but collect all your clippings as you go along and sanitize your pruners between plants, because the last thing you want to do is cut a diseased leaf and then transfer it to the next plant. I like to use a spray bottle of Lysol. I know people who like to use the wipes and then just wipe down their, but then for me, it's like, okay, what do I do with the used wipe? I end up with a pocket full of them, so I just carry a spray bottle of Lysol with me. And as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of extension publications on tomato diseases, and after a while, they all kind of start to look the same. How do I tell verticillium wilt from septorial leaf spot? Well, you go read the detail, and one gets a brown center, and one the center turns into a hole. Clip it off, and then go investigate. Take it off first. Okay, blossom end rot is not a disease. And here's my prediction. We're going to see a lot of it. Because people put plants in the ground when the ground was still cold, and we've had a lot of rain, and those are prime conditions for blossom end rot. So I would place a bet that Ask a Master Gardener is going to get a lot of phone calls about blossom end rot. And it's all related to the weather and when you set out your plants and how cold was the soil, what were the temperatures. And so it's one of the disadvantages of setting your plants out really early. My goal is not to have the first tomato. My goal is to have some of the best tomatoes. And if I have to wait for that, I will wait for that. But this is really attributed to inconsistent watering or inconsistent rain, if you're relying on nature, and cold temperatures. So it can happen later in the season if we get a cold spell that's also rainy, but it happens most at the beginning of the season, and I would expect to see a lot of it. It is not a lack of calcium. I look at 25 soil test reports every year I have yet to see one that says our soil is deficient in calcium. What happens is the soil is so wet, as the plant takes up the moisture, effectively the calcium is diluted. It's there, but they can't take up enough water without causing other problems to get the calcium that they need. So it tends to be sunken and hard. It looks ugly. If you cut it off, the rest of it is actually edible, but most people just can't bring themselves to do that. Because it's not pretty. Okay, other abiotic, that means, we did something, not the plant. Failure, how many folks have ever gotten to midsummer and the blossoms wouldn't set fruit? Yeah, we had it last summer. It gets stinking hot. When the daytime temps are above 90, but here's another one. If the nighttime temps are consistently above 75, the plant doesn't get any recovery time. And they need some recovery time because setting blossoms into fruit takes a lot of energy. So if it's just too hot, either daytime or nighttime or the combination, which is what we usually get, you'll get blossoms, but they won't set fruit. And the other thing that happens when it's that hot is your red tomatoes won't turn red. It's too hot for them to produce lycopene. So you just kind of wait for it to cool off. The other thing you can do, here's a term. How many folks know what the breaker stage is? We've got 1, 2, 3, couple. Breaker stage is when your tomato starts to turn from green, because they all start green, to whatever their color is going to be. So when it starts to change, like the lemon boy, it starts to change from green to yellow, or your big boy starts to turn from green to red, or even your Mr. Stripey starts to show some pink, that's the breaker stage. And you have almost all the same flavor as if you leave it on the vine till it's fully ripe. So again, at the community garden, we harvest at the breaker stage for 2 reasons. One is the fruits last longer when they get to the food pantry. And the second is we have learned the hard way that if you wait for them to get ripe, the birds come and they take one peck out of it, and now we can't send that to a pantry. So we pick at the breaker stage so that the birds don't become a pest and that the produce lasts a little bit longer in the pantry. And you can put up some shade cloth. It doesn't have to be pretty. I've actually done this just to lower the temperature a couple of degrees. I mean, if we're pushing 100, I can't get it back down below 90. But if we're in the low 90s, a nice piece of shade cloth draped over that will give you a couple degrees reduction, and you'll get a few more fruits to set. So you can rig up all sorts of things. Okay, questions? Yeah.
I saw an interesting video the other day on removing the little
Suckers?
and it said that remove the suckers that are growing up kind of with the stem of the plant. Don't remove the ones that are going outside ways, laterally, so that because that's just another. Anyways, your thought on, because originally most of them say remove all.
Yeah. Suckers is one of those things we could go do another 30 minutes just on suckers. But let me see if none of these are big enough to actually have. Oh, I got a little baby sucker here. Here's my main stem. Here's a branch, and now coming up in the middle here, that is a sucker. That's pretty small. And there are some who say remove all suckers. I'm not one of them. I like what your source said. We've got one major stem here. I like to keep at least one sucker so that I have kind of a second major branch. Because if we get one of those knocking down thunderstorms and a branch breaks, I haven't lost everything. So depending on where it's placed, I get really judicious of which sucker I decide to keep as a second branch. And sometimes I'm so tempted I'll keep a third. But then it's 3 and they're growing, they're not intertwining. Then I'm kind of in the camp of, I remove the suckers that are coming up and competing with the main stem, or there's just so much foliage that I can't get good airflow. If you ever come to Concord, when you look at the panels of tomatoes, you can see through them. And if you can see through the vegetation, then you have a pretty good chance that the airborne fungi, and it's largely fungal disease, those fungal spores will float right through and not get trapped. But I've seen trellises with tomatoes on them where it was just a wall of green, and you wouldn't know that there was a person standing on the other side. That definitely needs to be pruned. That is just trying to be a trap for fungal-borne diseases.
Would you ever remove any blooms?
Oh, yes.
What was the question?
The question was, would I ever remove any blooms? I would remove them if my plant had started to set blossoms before I got it in the garden. Once it's in the garden, I don't pick off blooms. Same is true with peppers. My pepper plant started to put out blossoms before I got it in the ground, I picked all those off. It's too stressful for them to still be in a small cell and try and grow and produce blossoms. But once they're in the ground, let them go. The big mama that I mentioned, I love that aroma. And it took me a couple of years growing it before I realized it's just a finicky plant. The first year, it got to a certain stage and its leaves started to curl. So I'm thinking disease. No, this is just a finicky variety. Its leaves will curl when it's too wet, when it's too dry, when it's too hot, when it's too cold. It just does that. But it just took me a couple of years to figure out that was the nature of that plant. None of the other tomatoes do that, but Big Mama does it every single year. Yeah. Yes?
Also true to not store picked tomatoes in the fridge?
Oh, yes. The comment was, don't put tomatoes in the fridge. That will turn them to mush. And just, now, if you've already cooked them down and made sauce, yeah, put that in the fridge. But do not put garden picked tomato in the fridge. Yes?
Does it make a difference when you're storing them after you've picked them to keep the blossom side down? So that, I've read that where you
Most
keep
folks say put the stem side down.
stem side, that's what I mean, sorry.
Yeah. I would tell you, I know, mine don't stay on the counter.
Yeah.
I harvest and I process or eat. Has anybody else done that? I know in the fall, when they say, you know, pick early, frost has been forecast, so go pick everything. I know then they say specifically to put them stems down. But anybody else have any experience with that?
We do stem side
You do stem side down? Throughout the summer as you're harvesting, okay. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, in reference to the breakers
The
stage.
breaker stage.
Yeah, I'm familiar with
There's that, I
that.
don't know, but
Any
I just remember
ideas
that
to
when I was
enhance
trying
ripening,
this.
highlight, low light, shoebox with a banana, I've heard that.
Oh. Where are you growing them? In a container, in the ground?
No, in the ground.
In the ground? You want them in one of the sunniest spots you can find.
Okay, so
If they're-
highlight.
Pardon?
Highlight is good.
Yes, highlight. Yeah, these are Solanaceae. They love the sun. Yeah. And it can be a challenge because the morning sun is not as strong. So if you get morning sun but no afternoon sun, yeah, they're not going to grow and ripen as fast. On the other hand, that afternoon sun, when we get to July and August, can be a bear and actually be too much. Yes.
Are you companion planting?
Companion planting. Yes, I do. And I could do the whole talk on companion planting. Most folks are probably, I'm going to assume, that you're familiar with the idea of planting basil with your tomatoes or planting marigolds with your tomatoes. And those are two really good suggestions. And those in particular, the aroma of the marigold and the basil deters many of the pests. But there are other companion plants that are not companions because of the aroma and what's going on above ground. It's for what's going on below ground. So things like borage, things like, no, that's for, nasturtiums go with vine crops. But borage is a good one because it pulls phosphorus out of the ground, kind of like comfrey does. Borage is the annual cousin to comfrey. So it will pull some of the nutrients up out of the soil and make them more readily available to the plant. And the flower draws in pollinators. So in some cases, the companion plant is related to the aroma and the pest deterrents, and in other cases, the companion plant is they get along really well underground. Oh, one of the ones that does well with tomatoes is dill.
I was wondering about
Dill,
that.
yep. And that's because of what's going on underground. Dill, and they actually say you can plant carrots with tomatoes. Now, I'm not inclined to do that because carrots don't like to interact. No, other roots become blockages for the carrot to grow through. So you're growing the carrot because it's beneficial to the tomato, not because it's going to be a great carrot. It's probably going to end up being a forked carrot where it ran into the tomato root. Yeah, companion planting, that's a whole nother topic. But a good question. Others? And then I've got, oh, here's another little one. Every now and then you get 2 tomatoes in a cell. You have a couple options. One is you can try and choose them apart, but you may be able to one or those. What you can do, in this case, I'm going to take the smaller one, cut it off at the very bottom, close to the soil, and I'm going to put it in a bottle of water where I've let it set so there's no chlorine in it, that it's off gas. And in about a week, that will have enough roots to put in the ground. Now, when you're pruning mid-season and you've got lots of suckers, and you've got a really big, beautiful-looking sucker, and it hurts to cut it off, put it in water, you have a replacement plant mid-season. Because mid-season, you will not find any decent-looking tomato plants at the nurseries. So, yeah. Yep, that will work. All those little hairs will start to grow roots in about 7 days, and there's actually a great picture in the tomato pruning video that I think I took at about 7 days. Okay, thank you for coming.